Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Newspeak, the New Culture Forum's weekly current affairs programme. This week I'm joined by Senior Fellow Philip Kiszely, Peter Whittle, the Director and Founder of the New Culture Forum, and journalist Poppy Coburn. So, Philip, would you like to kick us off by telling us a bit about what happened this week to Captain Tom?
Yes, it wasn't very nice, was it? It was a story that broke on Sunday morning. So this was a story that you read with your breakfast, and I was eating toast and orange juice, and this was a story.
This obviously burnt into your memory.
This is a story of a 21-year-old activist, eco-activist called Maddie. I've forgotten her surname now. From Manchester. She's an ex-student. She was a medical student. And according to her father, she's gone rogue, and she's just completely and utterly obsessed with eco. She's an eco warrior, basically, and she did this demonstration of pouring essentially a bucket full of shit over a statue of Captain Tom, and it was supposed to be a metaphor. She's against private jets and private jets belching pollution into the
very convoluted metaphor
into the environment, and that's the metaphor.
What do you think of this, Poppy? I know obviously you were saying that you've got a background in environmentalism.
Yes, so my background in environmentalism didn't involve so much human feces. I will say that. It wasn't quite as radical. I mean, I wasn't really surprised when I saw this story come out. And the reason why is I was doing a lot of my activism in 2018, 2019. And this was really when Extinction Rebellion was starting to gain public attention. And I remember saying then to some of the people I was working with, I think we're going to start to see more radical splinter groups coming out of this. And I looked into this group that this lady was a part of. It's only really two members. So it's this young woman and this man, and he'd been involved before in environmental activism. He tied himself at some football match to the goalpost. So these are clearly people who are very ideologically, convinced about the moral righteousness of their mission. Now it's a fringe group. Obviously, most environmentalists aren't like this, but I think as the rhetoric becomes more and more hysterical about the climate crisis, you're going to start to see more groups like End Private Jets UK. I mean, even Roger Hallam, who was the old founder of Extinction Rebellion, he left because it wasn't radical enough for him. He wanted to be disrupting Heathrow. He was doing stuff with Insulate Britain, which we all remember was, disrupting ordinary people's lives. So I think in the next couple of years or so, unfortunately, you're going to see more of this stuff.
I think just to build on that point, actually, these splinter groups are getting more radical. You can see it in the language. So they're calling it a climate genocide now. And so
that's
that
new,
word,
isn't it?
that's new. So that word genocide is really important, because if you're up against a genocide, that gives you license to do anything.
It also locks in with what they're now talking about, things like climate justice, and it's become part of the anti-racism movement. And actually, Policy Exchange and a few people who used to work in extremism called this quite early and said actually that this environmentalism is teetering on the brink of becoming a new kind of far left extremism. And actually in Cambridge, I mean, if you remember, they dug up the lawns of Trinity College and piled them up outside of a bank, and the disruption that they started doing with drones and things, they showed a clear willingness to break the law and put people's lives at risk because, like you say, they think anything justifies their actions.
I mean, the language is one thing, but the other really telling thing was when you looked at the image. Did you see the image of her, of the girl? I mean, she is a dead-eyed fanatic. You just look at the face and it's blank, and she's gone. Her father, who's devastated by the whole thing, said she's gone rogue, and you can absolutely see that. It makes you really wonder, how many young people are absolutely captured by this.
Do you think this is indoctrination, Peter?
Well, I think to an extent. I mean, I think we were discussing this before, actually, before we came on. There is this sense in which they have been gripped now by this catastrophism to do with the environment. The world is going to end, so almost anything, therefore, is legitimate. I mean, any kind of means are legitimate. But also, I think that there was a sense of frankly, when you say dead-eyed fanatic, to me it's unhinged to the point you sort of think maybe there's mental illness there.
Yeah.
I mean, this girl had massive eyebrows. I don't know what that was.
There was a Groucho Marx element to it, but
eyebrow shaming people now.
But you did say, actually, didn't you? I think on Sunday that this is it's not so much a political thing. It's not even environmental thing. It's a mental illness thing.
Well, it sort of is.
Yeah.
I think a mental illness, kind of stunted adolescent rebellion against authority.
But Poppy, don't you think that we've always had young radicals? That's something that has been pretty much a constant throughout all eras of history. But do you think that this is some kind of different phenomenon that we're seeing now, from your experience being sort of in the middle of it?
We know it's not unprecedented, and the reason we know this isn't unprecedented is prior to 9/11 and the explosion of government interest in radical Islamism, environmentalism was considered to be the main terrorist threat. So this was something that the FBI actually mentioned. It was a 1999 report that came out. The fear was environmental extremists. So it's kind of fallen off the agenda in the past 2 decades. And I think as we start to see, we've got a lot of channels now to do with like radical Islam. We've got the Prevent programme, but I think they are really missing out on the massive threat that is coming from these young people who feel that they've got no hope, who have been indoctrinated by this rhetoric which is telling them the planet is ending, they must be doing more radical action. I mean, if you think the world's going to end in 10 years, you're not just going to be blocking roads, you're going to go into more crazy stuff.
Do you mean actual sort of terrorism?
I would very much hope not, but I can 100% see in the next couple of years that we could have a violent terrorist attack, not just property damage. And I think it's something the government really needs to focus on.
I agree with you.
And actually you do see as well with all these different splinter groups, they are becoming more and more radical, because as one group splinters off through being more radical than the last, and then another, and then another, it's easy to see how actually, if you just look over the last short period of time, there's been this really rapid escalation of what they're willing to do. I mean, even things like putting people's lives at risk on the motorways by blocking roads and things like that. They think that it's more important for them to insulate homes than it is for people to be able to get through and ambulances to get to hospital, and people have actually really suffered as a result of that. But do you think that this is, I mean, obviously there's the aspect of how this is sort of baked into our education system now, but also just the fact that within popular culture, I've just been watching those new Frozen Planet documentaries by David Attenborough, and every couple of minutes he mentions climate change. He just will not let up. And you think that if you were a child watching this and watching the polar bears and the seals and all these cute animals, and you're being told that your species is basically not that he does say this, but the implication of the environmentalists, the more radical ones, is that human beings are basically a plague on the world, and we're killing all of these cute animals, and if we don't stop, then the threat is absolutely imminent. Do you think that I
think that's part of it, but I also think there's something about having a purpose and having something to believe in, and something that's higher. And I think a lot of these young people are lost.
A replacement for religion.
And it's a replacement for religion. It's a replacement for old party politics as well, I think, because it's a different kind of politicking, isn't it?
It's anti-democratic.
It's anti-democratic, but it plays into the identity stuff as well. And I think we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But there's something there about needing it. It's not because the crisis is tangible and real. It's because they actually need a crisis, and I think that's a really key thing.
What do you think, Peter, about the royal family have obviously been pitching in on a lot of this stuff? Whether or not they realise how divisive it is, I don't know. Not just Prince Charles actually, but now Prince William. And there was a piece in today's Telegraph about Prince William calling for urgent action on wildlife and so on.
Well, they've been doing this. It's the odd thing with the royal family. It's if you think of Charles, he's been saying we've got 100 days to save the world since about 2003. We're still kind of waiting. I do think it is.
It's the climate version of the NHS, isn't it? 24 hours.
But I do think it's
a classic apocalypticist sort of.
It is sort of sincere. There is a very strong environmentalist streak that comes from the conservative perspective, actually.
Yeah.
Very strong. I mean, you know, a lot of the people that I'm sure would go on these demos for Extinction Rebellion are from the countryside and from those sort of
just look at the age demographics. I mean,
Yes.
most people in Extinction Rebellion, they're not like radical teenagers with piercings. They're like middle-aged people.
Yes.
I remember being really embarrassed when I was going along
Yeah.
to the rallies. I was there with like my grandma and stuff like that. You know.
Spoken like a true young person. Sorry, it must be embarrassing to be on the show. No, I think.
Hang on, Peter.
It's only me and you, Peter. Come on.
I think,
Domino effect of offence.
I think that yes, the royal family, to an extent, the wildlife thing was always a big deal with the royal family, and I would go along with that. You know, I don't want species to be shot and things like that, and I think we should care for that. Just like with pollution, I think that maybe the way in which the monarchy has allied itself to this is that it's seen as being how should we put it, wide enough as an issue not to be controversial, whilst at the same time still being on board, and therefore, you know, they're thinking of the future, they're thinking of the way things are going, and you know, they want to survive. So I think there might be that. I think the difference is that what they don't have, what that kind of tradition doesn't have, is this people hatred that you mentioned. I mean, I think that there's a real hatred. I mean, you come across it, for example, in the calls that they make to not have children, right? Overpopulation. What I find interesting is in the Green movement more generally, that was a thing which they applied to the whole world at one point. Then it became rather embarrassing, because what it meant, I think it was Tony Benn who pointed this out. He said that what you're talking about is fewer brown babies, are you? Right? So now it's solely basically aimed at the European.
And this is part of the whole climate justice thing as well.
Yes, exactly.
How
How can you possibly have children, you know, when we are, you know, doing these wicked things and everything? They don't. Look, that argument's won. Europe's not reproducing. It hasn't been for ages. You know,
But it's how it segues very, very neatly into the identity politics thing.
Absolutely.
Isn't it? You know, it's the whiteness thing. It's that we.
Well,
it's
Black
not.
Lives Matter actually had it on their agenda.
Yeah.
Where that basically climate change was a racist thing.
Yeah.
You know.
Actually, I can't remember. Was it
We are
Kamala
malignant,
Harris? I think it was. Basically suggested that she, in response to this hurricane that hit the coast in the US, she said that they were going to allocate the funds available according to race.
yeah.
But the implication, of course, was basically that hurricanes in some way in the weather is systemically racist, because she was trying to financially account for the fact that the ethnic minority communities would be worse hit, even though that has no bearing on the facts.
The UN argues that as well. I mean, it's obviously nuts from Kamala Harris, but the UN is arguing that the floods in Pakistan are part of like a broader racist, you know, I mean, the idea that because Pakistan is located in an area of the world where there's a lot of flooding, that it's somehow racist that they're not immediately given like.
It's down to the British Empire, you know,
Yes, always.
and the excuse all the time, and it is an excuse, and this goes right across everything, is this word equity. You know, that's the Kamala Harris thing.
But it's so divorced from the facts as well, because the base sort of like underlying premise of it is that we in the West started the Industrial Revolution. We are responsible for climate change.
Greta said that, didn't she?
We're responsible for all of this, you know, change in the weather systems and so on.
So it's all down to us. Yeah.
But actually, the reality is, if you actually look at the facts, that it's countries like China that are pumping out the most greenhouse gases, and so. But it goes back to everything that we've been discussing now for 2 years.
But the thing is,
sort
as
of
well,
like a factual quality to a lot of these arguments.
Lest we forget, in the 70s, if you remember, and Peter Hitchens wrote about this not long ago actually, in the 70s, remember, the world was going colder, wasn't it? So it was cooling, and everybody was terrified that we're all going to be freezing cold. That's only 40 years ago. you know.
Can we quickly, before we move on to a different subject, just go back to what you said at the very, very beginning, Philip, about the symbolism.
About my breakfast.
About your breakfast and the symbolism of what this woman did, because I think there's another interesting aspect to this, and we've spoken a lot about statues and vandalism. But the fact that in the symbolism she chose to go for this, it's not really a statue of Captain Tom, is it?
Like
it was a kind of cutout.
Yes, it absolutely goes with the territory. You know, the old saying, the old nickname for environmentalists used to be, of the cranky kind, used to be watermelons. I read on the inside, green on the outside. There's a lot of truth in that.
That's James Delingpole's.
Yes, exactly. Far more.
They chose
radical.
a patriotic hero as the target.
Course. No, the whole thing. You've just mentioned it there. Actually, the whole thing used to be anti-capitalist, anti-American. It got harder to sustain that because, as you said, China and India are the biggest emitters of, and so they, basically, it's got that sort of anti-traditional. It even comes into the vegan movement. All of these things, it's basically about reject everything organically traditional. Everything.
And it also links into the Corbynista anti-Semitism as well, because there's an element of that, and historically there's always been an element of anti-Semitism in Extinction Rebellion.
But what, in the environmental?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Well, it's the anti-Semitic tropes of bankers and people who own the media and all of that kind of thing. Capital. So I think the symbolism is replete, and all you have to do is but it always makes me laugh. It's how ridiculously moronic is how long did it take to think of what can I do here, how can it be so complex? I know, I'll get a load of shit and pour it over a statue. Great.
It's feces and blood as well. It's
blood.
you think, where
Where's the blood
come
from? That's not very vegan.
It's horrible.
Anyway. So let's move on to we already mentioned the indoctrination of people into the environmentalist movement in schools, but I know Calvin Robinson has just had a documentary filmed for the New Culture Forum.
That's right, Emma. Yes, actually, this is by way of a preview, exclusive preview. Yes, Calvin Robinson, who used to be a teacher, remember, has done a heresies documentary. Philip has also done one in the past. Which these are our documentaries, as you know. You've done one. I'm sure you will do one, Poppy.
And you've done one as well, Peter.
Yes, we have. And basically, it is going out on this Sunday at 9:30, and it is about what is happening in our schools. Essentially, the idea that parents, which is behind this, is that parents don't really quite appreciate the level of indoctrination that's happening, usually around critical race theory and also about gender ideology, but also the general political bias that's increasing in classrooms. He's very good, Calvin, and the fact is this is something which I'm convinced is going to become a very big topic. We actually have a clip, Emma, which we can look at and talk about it afterwards. If you'd like to play it in, here we have a clip.
Education did not used to be a battleground. Schools used to be a place that parents sent their children to learn the 3 R's: reading, writing and arithmetic. However, these days we have a lot of activist teachers who want to be social justice warriors in the classroom and impart their own values onto your children. And in this programme we're going to be looking at 3 main areas. Race, this idea that black children and white children should be separated, and white children should be taught about their privilege and their unconscious bias, and black children should be taught that they are oppressed, they're victims, and we as a society are holding them back. Secondly, gender. The idea that your sex is something that is assigned to you at birth and that you later choose your gender as you grow up. And thirdly, general lefty bias. We know that 70% of teachers are left-leaning, but they are teaching resources that demonstrate that to be on the left of politics means that you care about people, you're compassionate, and you support the NHS, but on the right of politics, you care about yourself and big business. This is unacceptable, it's not what schools are for, and we're going to delve into it. One of the biggest areas of contention today is what is known as critical race theory.
What we are against is the teaching of contested political ideas as if they are accepted fact. We don't do this with communism, we don't do this with socialism, we don't do it with capitalism. And I want to speak about a dangerous trend in race relations that has come far too close to home to my life, and it is the promotion of critical race theory, an ideology that sees my blackness as victimhood and their whiteness as oppression.
Critical race theory might sound like a good idea in practice. Most of the advocates of critical race theory are well-intentioned. However, it comes from a dark place. It's set up, like all critical theories, to undermine the very fabric of Western society. And how that presents itself in education is that we are separating or segregating young people based on their skin colour. We're even separating and segregating the curriculum based on skin colour. In history lessons, we're teaching kids about black history, as if up until now we've only been teaching white history. Of course, we live in a predominantly white country, so most of our history will involve white figures, but that's not an issue of race. That's not racist. In this country, we teach British history, European history, and world history. We teach about the factual events that have helped shape the nation that we live in today. We do not teach about immutable characteristics in history. And the same in the music curriculum. There is an idea that we should decolonize it and remove dead white men. And that means replacing people like Mozart, who have helped shape music in composition, in the way that we understand music, in the way that we compose music, and replace people like Mozart with more fashionable figures like Stormzy, because he happens to be a black artist. Stormzy's most popular hit is Shut Up, Rude Boy, Shut Up. I wouldn't say it's of the same caliber as Mozart's, but this is the fundamental problem with critical race theory. It's not about meritocracy. It's not about the canon. It's not about teaching the best there has been or what has helped shape this nation. It's about what looks good. It's about virtue signaling, and it's about more brown faces for the sake of it and less dead white men for the sake of it. It's actually quite racist.
Well, I think it's a very interesting question, what are children actually being taught when it comes to critical race theory? Because I think it's not the case that teachers, it's clearly not the case that teachers are sitting down with children as young as 3, 4 and 5 and teaching them complex legal theories on race and racism. No teacher is standing there saying to a group of 7-year-olds, right children, it's 11 o'clock, it's time for our critical race theory lessons. And I think because of that, it's very convenient, if you like, for activists to be able to deny that this is actually happening. They can say, no, critical race theory is not being taught in schools, precisely because teachers are not sitting down and saying, take out your critical race theory books, boys and girls. But what is being taught are ideas that are inspired by critical race theory or derive from critical race theory. And put very bluntly, these are ideas of white superiority, white privilege, and black disadvantage.
One of the clips played in Calvin's documentary is of this famous now speech that Kemi Badenoch gave in Parliament, where she talks about contested ideas being taught in schools, and that we wouldn't do that with communism, we wouldn't do that with other ideologies, and yet when it comes to things like race, we see that teachers not only quite happy to teach these contested ideas, but actually that they don't even necessarily recognise that they are.
No, they don't. No. I mean, becomes quite clear that this is now considered to be the nice thing to do. This is the orthodoxy. In the programme, Calvin also goes into the very resources that are used. Textbooks are no longer used very much. A lot of it's drawn down from the internet, and basically also various third-party groups who are involved. This is a big thing, the people who come in to advise and to do these courses. And I think it is quite horrifying. What the answer is, I don't know what you think. I mean, when I look at this, I sort of think, homeschooling is what I think.
Well, I think you were probably most recently in school out of all of us. Were things quite ideological while you were at university and at college?
I mean, universities are something different. Universities have always been ideologically charged. But what I do remember at school is during my GCSEs, they'd brought in so I did a history GCSE, and they'd brought in a new module, and it was the history of migration. Now, I don't know how much people are familiar with the history. There's not really been much. It would be a very short course if it was accurate, because we've only really had mass migration the last 30 or so years, with a brief Commonwealth blip in the 50s. And that was a very clear example of something that has clearly been pushed by these activist groups. And the reason these activist groups are getting into the curriculum is because there is a vacuum on the right, because we are too afraid to essentially stand up for our heritage. People think, oh, that's a bit too extreme. We just trust in schools, we're trusting the government, they'll get everything sorted for us. That's not enough. We have to be far more muscular. If they have activist groups pushing for critical race theory, we need our own activist groups pushing back against that and saying, actually, no, this is wrong. Let's teach the facts about empire. Let's teach the facts about the immigration story. You can't just complain that the left is doing these things. You need to step up and say, no, you can't do that anymore. We've got our own ideas. We're going to argue the case for it too. Because I think things are too politicized now to stay neutral.
Yeah.
Philip, do you think that the solution is homeschooling, as Peter said, or do you think that, as Poppy said, we should be fighting to try and get schools to change? Because in the meantime, kids are sitting in classes, and they're not in the grand scheme of things, kids are not in school for that long. And so by the time, if you're a parent, by the time you change things, your child will have already moved on and the damage will be done.
I think it's a sometime combination of those two things. And the only thing about homeschooling that puts me off a little bit is that people with who are not so well off and working class people will struggle with homeschooling just because they won't have the time and the resources. But I just wanted to come back to what Kemi was saying, and I completely agree with almost everything she says, apart from the communism thing. That is presented as though it's the only thing, and that's reality.
Or more that, at least when I was at school, nothing really was presented on communism at all. There's just a whole blind spot where no one's even heard of Mao.
Well, I suppose what I'm saying is all of the ideology rests on Marxism and cultural materialism. It's there whether it's spoken about or not, because if you talk about university lecturers, they're going to be kind of 95% coming from a radical left Marxist perspective, and it's all of the stuff that we're talking about, from climate activism to transgenderism to critical race theory, all of it sits on cultural materialism, all of it sits on Marxism, and so that's the thing. You were saying we've got to depoliticize or possibly repoliticize in a different way, and it's undoing that. It's chipping away at that basis, and that's the really difficult thing
exposing to teachers and those involved in education the fact that these are ideologies, that these are contested. Because I think a lot of, if you're in any social circle, if you're surrounded by people who agree with you, you become basically adjacent to those views. And I think a lot of people in education could probably be described as being woke adjacent. Absolutely. Because like you were saying, it's incorporated into the resources, it's in the air, in the environment of the institution.
And it's so complex as well, because I'm talking about Marxism, and you'll say, oh, well, they're probably not, pure Marxists. Fair enough, but my God, they're postmodernists. You know what I mean? And postmodernism sits on top of that. So it's so incredibly difficult to pull it apart. And when you've got the key point that Peter's just made, that third parties coming in, and I'm thinking about Stonewall, that again takes it into a whole new environment that we haven't really known before.
And also people just don't know this. I mean when I say homeschooling, I mean it almost theoretically. Of course I understand. We only had to see the pandemic to see that actually it's always going to be better for middle class families who have a lot of books around, maybe bigger houses and all of that. It's going to be much harder for working class people to do that. It's just that somehow it's a bit of a counsel of despair, really, because we ask, how is this going to be changed? Well, I'm at a slight loss actually to know, because it seems to me that you're going to have to change the whole educational establishment. We're going to have, in some ways, a cultural version of the miners' strike, except for with the teaching union.
Without having spoilers for Calvin's documentary, and I would urge everybody to go and watch it when it comes out on Sunday. Does Calvin put forward a sort of positive vision, a way out of the situation?
Yes, he does. He comes up with some things, which again, which I don't want to say steal his thunder, but he's constructive, because I hope that's something about the New Culture Forum generally. We are being constructive. I mean, we've got a new book coming out. You're in it.
I'm writing about education in it, but I'm writing about higher education, and I offer some ideas about how we can go forward.
Yes, exactly. It's all about how we fight back. It's all about fighting back now. And I think that is crucial. So, of course, we're not just going to wring our hands when we do these programs. It's very comforting just to wring your hands. Actually, you can get, you can make
Lots
a
of
career
people in
out
the habit
of
of it. So let's move on to something else that's been in the news over the last couple of weeks, actually, repeatedly. The charity Mermaids, which is
relevant to
a charity, a trans kids charity that is currently being investigated by the Charity Commission. So just to sort of run people through the latest on this very controversial charity, the most recent news is that a trustee of Mermaids has stepped down after it emerged that he spoke at an organisation that promotes services for paedophiles. The charity, as I said, the Charity Commission is investigating them, and that's partly, I think, in relation to them sending breast binders to young kids behind their parents' backs. And these breast binders, as a side, it's important to recognise, particularly if they're not fitted properly, can actually cause damage. And so they were sending breast binders, and also in the news this week, also awful, they apparently have a service to help 16-year-olds change their name by deed poll without their parents' permission to whatever gender they are transitioning into. So, Peter, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, no, I think, obviously it's repulsive and obscene, actually. And I hope, really, that maybe in not that distant a future, we look back and think, what the hell was going on, actually? Because it seemed to me it's child abuse. But I think this very pertinent point is about the not telling of the parents, and breaking the authority between parents and children. That is Marxist, actually. I mean, if you want to cut down, if you want to cut people completely adrift, that is the way you do it.
Well, this actually goes back to what you were saying, both about environmentalism and Black Lives Matter, the intention to undermine the family, because the family is sort of the first safeguard, and if they are undermining parental authority, they are undermining the safeguarding and the legal rights of that child to be protected by their parents. Also interesting, related to this in the news this week, I don't know if you saw Sussex police's the whole hoo-ha about not misgendering this paedophile rapist, and what this has sort of kicked up is a whole discussion around the issue of safeguarding, and the fact that a lot of this stuff has huge, deeply profound implications for not just for children's safeguarding, but for safeguarding in general. We had that great conversation with Caroline Fisk on this show, where we talked about how basically if you ask children to go against their instincts and to doubt their own experience, and at the same time you're also, like you were saying, Peter, cutting them off from their parents in that way and going behind their backs and basically making that that's
absolutely the centre of it. One of the really interesting things about this is how quickly it's moving. I remember being on this show a couple of months ago and talking about Tavistock, and we were talking about all of these things about potentially performing treatments on children behind their parents' back. Now we've moved one step further, and it's explicitly paedophilia. Paedophilia is there in the system, and this person, I think he's called Jacob, I can't remember his surname, Breslau, I think, Jacob Breslau, he's a lecturer at LSE. I
mean, if I may, this link between organisations that have a very explicitly left-wing bent, that are focused on this sort of gender ideology, and this is something that's been around for a while. You can kind of go back to Judith Butler, and before then, certain French, political theorists were also talking about this. This link between gender and paedophilia is actually quite an old one. So I can think back to Foucault. So Foucault, obviously, the father of postmodernism, he also signed this very controversial French petition to get rid of the age of consent. Judith Butler, who is literally cited on the Mermaids website as somebody who's influential on the ideology, also promoted paedophilia, talked about the age of consent as being a social construct. But I think let's not get too bogged. I mean, this is an awful example, but there are actually a hell of a lot of charities out there that are doing the same thing. Mermaids got £200,000 from the lottery last year, which is nationally funded. They got £40,000 directly from the government as part of their charity status. This is being government funded. And it's not just Mermaids. We are funding lots of charities that are explicitly anti-British, communist, harmful to children. And instead of just saying, oh, this is disgusting, I mean, it's disgusting, but we should be telling the government, you need to get rid of it. We need to reform the Charity Commission from top to bottom.
But I think it's a very good point you make, Bob, because they're not actually even really charities in that way.
No.
They are arms, disconnected arms of a government.
But this actually goes back to what we were saying about Kemi's speech and the idea of contested ideas, that there is a lack of recognition that these things are political. Charities are not allowed to be political. They're not allowed to engage in that kind of thing. And if they were,
they are though. It's like 2011 law means that there's a loophole. It was brought in under Cameron's government, and it's part of the Charities Act 2011. It basically says if you're promoting the equality of a marginalised group, it gives you an exemption where you can still receive charity status and be political. I mean, this should be, I wish this came out more in the reporting, because we can get rid of that law. We don't need that law.
But do you know what the crazy thing about this is? You talked about Judith Butler, and she is God in this area, isn't she? Judith Butler is a philosopher who's really pushed the gender thing, basically, and she thinks gender is just completely and utterly a social construct. But I think you've had Douglas Murray on So What You're Saying Is, and you got him to read out a sentence that was complete and utter gobbledygook.
Yes,
well, the whole book, Gender Trouble, I don't know if you've read the whole thing.
I read it at university.
Right. The thing is, no one's actually read the whole thing. It's like everyone says they have, and nobody hasn't. Very, very few people have read it from beginning to end, because it's absolute gobbledygook.
Yes.
And so what happens, these ideas, which are just snippets from the book, gain their own kind of pace, and people just kind of make it up as they go along, and they don't really know what they're doing, because her prose is just so appalling. So it's not rooted, it's not grounded in anything. And that's one of the reasons why it's really frightening.
Well, it's post-structuralism.
Yeah, it's not meant to
by
be.
definition.
It's their modus operandi to write in a way that that obscures and obfuscates everything that they mean.
Foucault's most famous now, isn't he? Someone who used to go and sexually exploit young Arab boys.
Yes. In graveyards, I think, as well. So maybe their actions might say a little bit about the philosophy that given that these are ironically people who believe that ideologies and ideas justify power, it seems that maybe Foucault's philosophy was there to justify his bad behaviour. But anyway, let's leave that for another day.
Your average person would conclude that. But,
So just before we tie things up, this week it is the Tory party conference. The news has been endless on everything that's going on, so it's far too much for us to go into in detail. But just on the Conservative Party's future as it stands now, what is at stake at this conference? Could, if it's possible, we'll give you three. Do you have any sort of final closing thoughts on the Conservative Party conference and what's at stake?
Well, the conference, I think, is they're trying. It's an exercise in damage limitation at the moment, isn't it? The conference, I think. But I think the general point, which is not an original one, but I think the general point is that what we've seen is the triumph of an ideology this time, which is libertarian, free market fundamentalism, at the very time when the country is broadly economically going slightly to the left, but culturally conservative. They have gone entirely the other way.
Entirely the opposite.
Entirely the other way. But what has really a pop, which I hate, right? But what is really strikes one about this is the sheer incompetence which they've done it. It's unbelievable. You know, there's been no finesse, nothing. It's like the kind of prefects are running the school.
Yeah.
The political communications couldn't really have been more
worse. I listened
garbled.
to I listened to Nick Robinson's interview this morning, and it was just a car crash with Liz Truss. It was a car crash. I think two things on that. First thing is the obvious thing, which is 2 years is if they survive until next week. 2 years is a long time in politics, and anything can happen. Who could have called COVID and so on and so forth. But the other thing is, and it links to what we've just been talking about, it's the utter horribleness of the Labour Party activists. And you've seen them outside of... you were in Birmingham. I don't know whether you saw anything yesterday.
We were outside what's called the secure zone.
Right.
But no, I mean, they're out in force, aren't they? And the police aren't really controlling them that much.
But
they're horrible.
People see that, and people see caring, sharing, be kind, socialism and identity politics, and it's an absolute anathema to them. So I think that could save the Conservative Party. Who knows?
It could indeed. You're quite right. You know, a huge number of events come along. We don't know what. But speaking of, I have to mention this. Speaking of awful Labour supporters, don't know whether she's a Labour supporter, but I think, you know, repulsive person of the week must go to that woman who said that Tories should not be resuscitated.
The nurse.
The nurse.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, I didn't see
this.
this.
Yes, this was on the Jeremy Vine show.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And basically, I think she's quite well known because she's been on other panel audiences. But basically, this is the kind, caring left for you.
Tories shouldn't be resuscitated.
Yes, Tories shouldn't be resuscitated. Okay. Give me Dr. Crippen, because he's more humane. Yeah, give me Dr. Crippen.
I mean, look, the Conservative Party is clearly the better alternative to the Labour Party. But I'm sorry, we deserve better than that. I mean, it's not difficult to be better than the Labour Party at the moment. And the fact that the electorate are flocking to them at the moment shows, I mean, I don't think there has been a government that has deserved to lose an election more than this one. They have failed at their own mission. You know, they are not Conservative. They are not conserving anything. So frankly, I don't really have much sympathy for the government. I don't want to see a Labour, but if it happens, it happens. I hope that at least from the ashes, something better can rise out of it.
I think we're all in the same situation, aren't we? It's not that we want this government at all. It's just that we desperately don't want the Labour government.
Yeah.
But they rely on that.
Exactly. They're never going to change.
Exactly. It's the worst of all possible situations to be in.
Well, I think ultimately we're just on all sides in a deep political crisis, and anything that we get is going to be reflective of that, unfortunately. So that's a bleak note to end on.
Somebody make a joke.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you, thank you, Philip. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Poppy. Too many P's. And we thank you also for watching, and we'll see you next time on Newspeak.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel, and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.